Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another meeting of the Research Triangle PowerShell User Group. My name is Mike Kanakis, and it is March 15th, 2023. And tonight, we're going to be talking about APIs and how APIs interact with PowerShell. Before we get to our guests tonight, let me introduce my co-host. Hello, Mr. Phil. How are you? And so tonight, we have a special guest in person, Mr. Stevie Costa of Chocolatey fame, and PowerShell community member and active participant in the community. Stevie came and said, guys, I want to come and present in person. Would you guys mind? And we were like, sure, come. And so if you're wondering why Stevie came in person, it's just he was bored. So he just wanted to drive and come and visit us. So Stevie drove 1,700 miles to get here tonight. He left yesterday evening. And we're so happy that he made the drive, come and hang out with us. Hey, Stevie, why don't you say hello? You can also turn on your camera on your computer if you want. All right. Thanks, Stevie. What are we going to be talking about tonight?
So this is practical API usage with PowerShell. Technically part 2 of a talk that I did, like 6 weeks ago or so.
Yeah.
For this group. Don't freak out if you missed part 1, because we're going to cover a bunch of part 1 before we dive into part 2. Just to make sure everybody is on the same page. Little about me, I guess. Most of you probably know me from chatting in the meetings and stuff like that, but I work for Chocolatey. I'm a package manager for Windows. I'm a support manager for those guys. And I spend most of my day wrestling PowerShell, helping customers, or whatever else is thrown in my plate. I wear a lot of hats. So for those in the room tonight, I expect questions, because if you ask questions, I will throw you something. Sorry for all of those folks that are not here with us in person. If you're coming to Summit, come see me at Summit. I'll make it up. I know that. But yeah.
All right. So we're going to hand it over to Mr. Stevie. And so I'll just say that if you're watching at home and you're wondering about Stevie Costa, he is a very active PowerShell community member, and he has been a very good friend of the group for many years and a personal friend of mine. I'm very thankful for all the contributions he's made to our group. I have worked with him offline very much to help learn a bunch of things, to help myself be a better individual with using PowerShell. He's just an all-around good guy. And I say that because if you're looking for people to follow in the community, whether it be on Twitter or some other resource, Stevie is one of the best to follow. He's always doing something that's interesting. He always has useful information to share with people. And so I would encourage you to take a look at his Twitter profile and follow him. He has a lot to say and a lot to share. But with that, we're going to hand it over to you, Stevie. Thank you again for coming 1,800 miles. We appreciate the drive. He walked it, by the way.
Uphill, my dogs are barking.
Yeah. But seriously, we're going to hand it over to you, and I super appreciate you taking the time to hang out with us.
Absolutely. So I want to start from the very beginning. So for the folks that missed part 1, the gist of part 1 is why are APIs important? So an API is what? It's an application programming interface. It allows you to, no matter what your programming language, have a universal thing that every language can talk to and get data from. Typically, an API is going to return data to you in a couple of different formats, JSON being the most prevalent one. There's XML. Depending on if you're uploading files or working with things like that, you can do other applications if you want to, or other content types rather. But JSON is really the lion's share of an API. But they're really, really great because as a PowerShell person, you could have a development team that's written some application in a devil language like Go or Java that you have no idea how to work with that stuff, but you know PowerShell. So if they've got an API, you can access that API and work with it and get the objects back that you're used to, right? We're very object oriented when it comes to PowerShell. And PowerShell is extremely helpful in that it takes that JSON response back from that API and automatically creates a PS custom object for you. You don't have to do anything. Ask the API for the data, it sends it back. PowerShell's like, oh, this is JSON, this is coming from an API, I'm going to make an object. Here you go. And then you can do whatever else you want to do with that. If it's send it down the pipeline to something else, you can do that. If you want to ship it off to some other system, you can do that. You need to email it, make an Excel document, whatever you can do with PowerShell, you can use that data to do that work. So that's really the gist of APIs. They're this amazing, awesome thing. They're super powerful and they're prevalent everywhere. If you use Azure at all and you're good with PowerShell and Azure, all of those commandlets that you're using to spin up and spin down and change and do all of your stuff in Azure is the Graph API. It's all an API. There's a programmatic interface that it doesn't matter if you're writing a C# application, there's an SDK for that to interact with the API. If it's PowerShell, there's this Graph API module that you use that has all these commandlets that are nothing more than really fancy wrappers that send stuff to Invoke-RestMethod, and there you go. So if you get really good and comfortable with Invoke-RestMethod, you can make all kinds of modules that wrap all these different APIs for all these different systems that you have and become really, really efficient at what you're doing. You don't have to no longer, log into this website to do this thing or open this app to do this thing. It can all be in your shell and all bolt together. It's very, very, very handy. So there's a couple of different methods inside of an API as well. The most common one, I would say, is a get method, which does exactly what it sounds like on the tin. It's going to get data from that API endpoint and return it to you. Another API method that you'll use quite frequently is a post method. If you've got, say you're working with some sort of a PowerShell object and you need to send that data to an API, you would use a post method for that. There's also a put method, which is kind of sort of the same thing as post, but it's different in that it will also do updates. So if you've got like an existing record and you want to like completely update a whole bunch of stuff inside of it, you can use a put method for that. There are drawbacks and caveats between post and push, or post and put rather. One of them is a true update and the other one will overwrite the thing that's there. So if you've got an existing record that you say it's a car, for example, and you want to change the motor from a V6 to a V8 via a API call, you don't want to do a post with just the ID of the car and the engine, because that car will then be an ID and an engine. Everything else is gone. So you want to make sure you use the right method so that all the other stuff, like how many doors does it have, and it's black, and it's 4-wheel drive, and whatever, all that stuff stays, and the only thing that changes is the thing that you set to it, being engine, changing it from one thing to the other. And there's delete endpoints, so you can delete data. Those are dangerous, to say the least. Obviously, you want to be careful if you're doing things with a delete method. You want to be careful with any of them, but especially with a delete method, because sometimes that stuff's hard to get back. It's a really good way to test your backups, is doing a delete method. So we're going to kind of dive into what that looks like practically to get really, really good at an Invoke-Rest method. And we'll start really, really, really simple. I'm just going to create a new file right here on the root. Actually, let me just do it. Call it stuff.ps1, right? So, and let me open up a web browser too and go to httpbin.org. So httpbin.org, and if somebody wants to throw that in the chat at some point, I know somebody will be in there. If you want to throw that link in the chat for me, that'd be cool. This is a really cool website that allows you to test API calls using Invoke-RestMethod. Super great. You can do things like testing all the different verbs. So if you say, here's a get method and it doesn't have any query parameters and it expects a 200 or you should get a 200 response out of it. That's fine. So if we try this out and hit execute, it's going to work and it's going to send us back arguably nothing. So what we can do is just grab this URL here. Actually, let me switch it to HTTPS so things don't out. Get back up. So what do we need? We know that we need a URI. And is that text good for everybody in the room? A little bit bigger? We can do that. How's that? Good? Perfect. Everybody, if you're watching at home and need it bumped up, tell somebody in the chat so they can tell me. So we will put this in here like so. And then what else do we need? So we know what an API is and what it does and how it interacts. One of the things we need to tell it is, what kind of method am I going to work with, right? So for this, it's very, very clear in this document, and we'll talk about a little bit what this is later, but this is a get method, which is technically the default method for Invoke-RestMethod whenever you're going to use it. If you leave method off, it's going to do a get. So we've got our method, and just make that a variable. And then again, we need to know what our content type is. What kind of data is that URL or is that endpoint expecting and going to return to us? So again, we can go to this document here and we can look and see this get method, and the response content type is application JSON. So let's go ahead and say our content type is equal to application/JSON. And for this particular endpoint, that's all we need to make an API call to this. So now we can use Invoke-RestMethod, and we can give it our URI of URI, our method of method, and then our content type of content type. And if we were to take all of this and kind of just run that selection, it works. And there's our stuff. So let's make this a little bit clearer, shall we? So let's do result is equal to that Invoke-RestMethod. Run all of that. And now in here, I should have a result variable, and we can get all the different information from it. And then we can say result get type. Notice it's PS custom object. Yeah, it's pretty cool. That's something that you're very familiar with. It's easy to work with it. You can do other things with it. We can even be silly and say, okay, I want to convert to JSON. Well, there's my JSON back if you really want it as JSON. Or you could do convert to JSON as if you're on, actually, does that not work?
That's convert from, not convert to.
From. Yeah, you're right. As soon as I, yep. But yeah, it's relatively easy to do PowerShell things with it. If I wanted to send this to a file, could. If I wanted to email it, I could. If I wanted to do whatever with it, I could. So it doesn't take a whole heck of a lot to get started using Invoke-RestMethod. Now it does get harder depending on how complicated the API is, but it's not so bad that you won't pick it up relatively quickly, because the pieces and parts that make it up are extremely familiar to you if you write a lot of PowerShell. To make a another example out of this, I think the same endpoint will just, if I send it a body, it will spit out the same body. There might be a post endpoint for that. So let me see. Yeah, I think this is going to be what I want. So I'm going to change this method over here to post, and I'm going to add a little bit to this. So actually, I can do this like this. I'm going to start turning this into a hash table instead. That way we can do the fun things with splatting that we're probably quite used to with longer commands, where you can say, hey, here's a hash table of all the parameters for Invoke-RestMethod, and it'll run it. Makes it easier to read it going down this way as opposed to scrolling off to the screen to the right. Your brain follows that a lot easier than trying to find out where you're at if your lines are long. So splatting is awesome. You should do that. And then for this particular post method, I want to see what happens if I send a body to it. So I'm going to say my body is going to be just a hash table. That's all you need. And then I'm going to say name equals RTP sug me. And we'll see if that's enough. Actually, to make this a little bit easier to read it, because I'm going to do something to it here. I'm going to take this and I'm going to say it, but APIs expect JSON, right? I'm going to cast that body, that hash table. I'm going to in flight convert it to JSON while it goes up. I don't think that's particularly necessary anymore with the new Invoke-RestMethod commandlets, but it's a habit I got into on Windows PowerShell because you had to convert the body to JSON to send it, and now it's just muscle memory at this point. So that's how I do it to this day. And so if we were to do this, oops, I forgot to grab, it's the post URL. There we go. That looks better. Let's see, what's the result in here? Yeah, so it's in there. So if we look at result, we've got the data in the object. That is the body of the request that I sent. So if you look at the raw JSON, it comes back as a hash table here. But that's how you post data to an API. Depending on the Swagger doc, it'll typically tell you of what stuff is required for it to work. If we look at, there's another Swagger pet store. Yeah. So here's a post method. So it says there's no parameters on this one, which is annoying because it's got a schema. So it should parameters. This is a very bad example. Let me what happened. Hey, wouldn't you? We'll come back to Swagger after that's figured. there any questions about the invoke rest method stuff that we've seen so far? It's relatively straightforward, but I want to make sure everybody's following along, especially in chat, etc. Just know there's only a couple of really important pieces of information: URIs, methods, content types, and then if it's something that you're sending data to, whatever the body of the request is, whatever that looks like. We'll add authentication here in just a second.
Is the body necessary if they do it closed?
Typically, yeah. Yeah. Sometimes not. It depends on the API. Like, you might want to have a get endpoint that the body tells the endpoint what to fetch. So if there's a lot of data to that, that get request will have a body to it, so that it knows.
What that question was? They might not have heard that. Other body.
Yeah, the question, is the body always required in a post or a put?
The body's always going to be required in a post or a put, because you're sending data, and the way to do that is through a body. There's one caveat to that, and that's if the URL uses query strings to do its data, the data that is going to be written is going to be in the URL itself, not in the body. So it's kind of API dependent, but the lion's share of APIs are going to require a body if you're going to do a post or put.
Right, these requests, you press transit.
I'm
sorry, I forgot to unmute. Are the requests compressed when they're sent to the server on the other side and or received?
Depends. Again, it depends on the API and what you're doing. If it's JSON data, typically not. If it's uploading a file, yes, it's going to do some magic to make the bits go where they need to go. But typically not. Typically it's just a JSON payload. Because JSON's the small anymore. There's no compression built on top of it.
Thank you.
So let's talk about authenticating to an API. This is something that typically can trip a lot of folks up because it requires the use of headers. So right now we haven't added any headers to our requests. We've got some because Invoke-RestMethod is kind of doing it for us, and this is the headers that the response. This is the headers for the response, not the actual request. So Invoke-RestMethod kind of built its own default ones to make the request, and then the response sent back the headers that it built to send the response. So if we want to send our own headers, there is a header parameter. And that is just a hash table. It can be a hash table. You don't have to do anything fancy with it. It's just a hash table. The lion's share of APIs that you'll work with are going to have two authentication methods, one or the other. Sometimes they have both. Just kind of depends on the API and the implementation. One of them is basic, which is like username and password type stuff. And then the other is bearer, which is token based, like OAuth. Think OAuth, that's a token. The nice thing about PowerShell 7 is that stuff is baked in as parameters at this point. So what that means is I could say Invoke-RestMethod authentication and give it basic bearer OAuth. Bearer and OAuth, there's slight differences there, but basic implementation, it means the same thing. It's just a token. So basic means authentication. So if I were to say basic authentication, that means I can use a credential for it. And for this, I can say get PS or get credential, rather, like that. So if we were to look and make this part of our splat here, we could say authentication equals basic, and our credential is equals to get credential. And then we could drop all of that stuff off, and then we wouldn't need our headers. In PowerShell 7, it's enough to just say, hey, what kind of authentication is it? And here's a credential. Or if it's a bearer, this becomes token instead of credential. And for this, you'll want to say your token here, convert to secure string as plain text force. The token parameter is a secure string. So you'll want to either beforehand make a secure string and just pass that to this, or do whatever. Do something like this. And it is enough to say, like, if you wanted to, you could have a credential object. So credential equals get credential. And then you could just come in here and say credential.password. That would work because .password here is a secure string as part of the object. So that would work. So it really depends on what you're doing and how you're designing things. It's a little bit easier to use a credential object than it is to use a secure string object if you're going to like build a script and it's going to talk to an API and it's got OAuth and it needs a token, because the onus is on them to do, the onus is on the user to say my token or whatever it's going to be, and then convert to secure string. And I can't type, but the onus would be on the user to do this part as part of the parameter. Whereas if it's just if you're going to use a token as part of your Invoke-RestMethod call and your function parameters has a credential in it, you could say default the username to like a dumb username, or just leave it blank, or whatever you want to do. And then if they don't give a credential on their own, it's either going to prompt them for a username and then a password, or if it prompt them one of two ways. Let's clarify. Prompt them one of two ways. If it's like here in the shell and I needed a credential object, it would be a prompt in here that says username. I would fill it in, hit enter, and then boom, it would ask me for my password, fill it in, hit enter, done. If it's like Windows PowerShell and it's PowerShell.exe and I run a script, it's going to pop up a little GUI window, the Windows credential thingy that we're all very familiar with and love dearly, to put your credentials into, and then it stores that and passes it along. So once they've given a credential, all we care about is the password. So you can come in here and just say, hey, credential.password, and you're done. So
that comes not a parameter.
What's that?
Token's not a parameter.
It's not?
No.
I thought it was. It is. So if I were to do authentication there, and then
Does that run on PowerShell core?
this.
Oh,
Yeah, this what I'm seeing here with authentication bearer and then token stuff, this is only available in PowerShell, not Windows PowerShell. So PowerShell 6 Plus is where the authentication and the bearer and tokens and all that stuff.
sorry, my parameter search failed me.
No worries. I thought they changed something on me. I was like, what do you mean? I use this all the time. Crap. Yeah. Okay. 4,500 now? 4,500? Come on, 3,000. All right. So just to show you guys a little bit of what authentication might look like in the real world, I went ahead and pulled a couple of examples together. So here's one example. Actually, no, here's not. It's not in there. It's somewhere else. Where did these go? There's no data in here. This is what I get for doing stuff late at night, apparently. All right. Hold on. So function. Oh, no, definitely not good. Aha. Oh, it's better. All right. So what might it look like in real life to try to authenticate against an API? This is my connect Nexus server function from my Nexus shell module, which allows you to connect to a Sonatype Nexus repository server, and then after you're connected, do other stuff to the API. And it doesn't really do much. It's not like a persistent connection type thing. All this does is creates a header for you and then scopes it to the module appropriately so that you don't have to pass that header in anymore. It's just there. And then all the other functions check and make sure that you actually created that header. If that if that variable doesn't exist, it's going to throw an error that says, hey, did you run your connect function first before you tried to do this? So it kind of guards you a little bit. But it's not overly clever. It says, what's the URL for the host name of the server that I'm going to connect to? So if it's like repository.steviecoaster.dev or whatever it is, what's the host name of my server? What are my credentials for connecting to that repository? Is it on a specific like context path? So is it repository.steviecoaster.dev/nexus or /whatever? Or is it just the default with a slash at the end? Does it use SSL? So is this an SSL based connection or an HTTP connection? And what's the SSL port? That defaults to 8443 because in Nexus world, that's the default port for SSL and Jetty, which we won't get into the nonsense that is Jetty, but that's what it is. And then basically I'm just creating script scope variables for the SSL port and the protocol, whether it's HTTPS or HTTP. And I set my host name to a script and my context path. And then I do this really weird thing for basic authentication. And this is where I said basic authentication gets a little weird because it's not just a username and a password pair. It expects a base 64 encoded string as part of that header. So what does that look like? Well, we ask for credential, and then we put it into this format. So we say username on the left, colon, password on the right, and that's what we're doing here. We're saying format this string with the credential.username on the left, and then the plain text password is this guy on the right. And that's our cred pair. And then we encode them, and we say system.convert to base64 string. We say UTF-8 get the bytes of the cred pair, and we get our base64 encoded string. And then we build our header by saying, hey, the authorization is basic, and here's my encoded credentials. And then I attempt to call a endpoint. In this case, I call the status endpoint just to verify that the credentials work, because it doesn't really do much, but says, yep, I'm good, or nope, I'm bad. So that's what this does, and then we're done. That's it. I do pop a little message out that says, hey, connected to hostname, color green. Otherwise, I throw an error. And I do this line here. So result equals Invoke-RestMethod at params error action stop. This call to the status endpoint will return something. The API will respond with the status of the server. I do not care. So I stuff it in a variable so it doesn't get sent to the screen, and then I write my own message. I absolutely could allow Invoke-RestMethod to return whatever that data is and say, yep, I'm good. Here's the status of the server and my connected message. That seemed entirely too busy for me. All I wanted to know was, am I connected? Yes. So that's why I stuff it in something. I could have very well just said null equals here as well. Whatever. I just said result because I use result equals Invoke-RestMethod for everything. Anytime anything a rest method, it seems, I always stuff it in a result variable. That's one way to do authorization. And a lot of the times in PowerShell, when you're writing modules to wrap an API and you want to do something like this is a pretty common thing to want to do, especially for something that's like, it's not got a refresh token or anything like that. There's more advanced APIs out there that allow you to connect to it, request a token from the API with your credentials, and then use that token for subsequent calls to the API. And then that token expires at some point. And then you've got functions for refreshing that token and getting a new one in the same session, et cetera, et cetera. We're not going to dive into that because that's crazy stuff. And it's way, way, way in the weeds for what we want to look at tonight. But stuff like that is possible, and the Graph API is one of those ones that works like that. So,
but it's probably worth mentioning here that the reason you do all this is because you do this over and over and over again, right? And so you could easily do all this at the command line interactively every time you connect.
Yep.
Certainly possible. Nothing wrong with doing that.
Yep. Absolutely.
You've just decided that it's not worth the time. And so it's worth the 30 minutes to write a function.
Yeah.
Test it out so that you get 30 seconds back every day that you run this multiple times a day.
And it's a consistent experience for the end user.
Right.
At the end of the day, what's step one? Every single public function that's available in this module, if you don't run your connect first, is going to throw an error that says, hey, you forgot to connect to the server before you did this thing. So please go do that. Could I have written it a different way so that you had to pass credentials to every single public function every single time you wanted to do something with this particular API? Yeah, absolutely could have. Could have done this header stuff in every single function and duplicated that effort. It was way less effort to write one function to create a script scoped header and then just use that header everywhere and be done with it. And I did write, it's up on my GitHub, and I'll have some links that we can put into the chat shortly. But this whole nonsense here is pretty convoluted to remember. It's like, okay, I need a base 64 encode a pair of credentials. What the hell was that code again? Well, if you look in here, here's new encoded credentials. So if I were to run this, let me get this out of my way. I wish this would be like down. Or say new encoded credential.
Only those great customized.
Yeah. Credential, let's say get credential and just run that. So if I put in a username here and some password, there's my encoded credential. It just gives it to me. Or if I wanted to say as a header, and I could put in my credential again, there's my header that I can get back. So if we come back to my stuff function, for this, I could take out this stuff and I could say header equals new encoded credential, get credential as header. So we could do something like that and it would be fine. This header would contain as this. Yeah, it is as headers. We should call that as hash table instead of as header. But
And so when you're using the encoded 64-bit piece there, what is the encoding actually doing? Is it just changing the form or the output of the string of data, or is it encrypting it and making it so it's safe to pass it publicly?
That's basically it. It's just base 64 encoding it to send it over the wire so that the API can unencode it and use the credential. Obviously, that's why they say basic authentication is almost as insecure as no authentication at all, especially if you're like over an HTTP API, because that's in plain text anyways. So a man in the middle to grab the headers, decrypt the header, the base 64 string out of that authorization header. There's your credentials.
So it's encoded, but
Yeah,
everybody knows how it's encoded, and so it's simple to
it's not that safe. It's not that safe. Now, if you add SSL on top of it and you're sending it to a
security there definitely comes from the transfer layer.
was that?
That was Ryan. I'm not sure if someone just chatted with him in the background.
He asked a question I couldn't hear. But yeah, SSL is going to encrypt the whole thing. So you got to break into the encryption of the SSL before it can get this. But still, if you get into there and this is basic authentication, you can still get the credentials out of it. That's why tokens are a little bit safer, because they're not associated with like an actual credential at all. It's just token. So if a token gets posed, yeah, it's a problem, but it's relatively easy to revoke a token and the credentials are still safe. Yeah. Obviously.
Other thing to remember is that a token is a reduced level set of the credentials, so it may only have delegated access to a certain part of what the entire user credential can access.
Exactly.
So nice, we're just able to say grant access to only my email or grant access to only this scope of the API.
Yeah. There's definitely a difference between authentication and authorization. A user can authenticate to an API, but if they're not authorized to use any part of the API, functionally worthless. So a token will grant authorization to certain parts of the API, and you can, as he said, scope it to, hey, this guy's got keys to the kingdom, this guy can only read user data, or this guy can only read group data, or this guy can only update this thing, whatever this widget is. So it goes without saying that if you're going to start working with APIs, it's really good to understand the authentication of the API. How do I even access the thing is going to be step one. And I don't think I have. This did not load earlier. Correct. Do not understand why this one is not loading. This is another one. Do you want to go back to your VM?
That you loaded?
Yeah, I think I got it. Yeah, I got to see it from here. That's fine. Where was I going with this one? Oh, yeah. This is that pet store swagger thing. This is their login example, if you want to call it that. They use a GET request to do it, for one, which is silly. But this is an example of a API that uses query string parameters. So there's no body to this request. But if you look at the end, they say, here's my login endpoint. I need the username in the URL and the password in the URL. And for that, I'm using a credential object and then just grabbing the bits. So credential.username and then credential.getNetwork, credential.password to get the plain text password. And I'm sending that stuff in the URL to the endpoint out in the open, whatever. That's like the most insecure thing I've ever seen in the world. I don't know why they wanted to use that as an example for logging in, but they did. So here we go.
And so that is just a difference in the developer of the API, whether or not they wanted to do it one way versus the other.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
So
Yeah, exactly.
you kind of beat me to a point that I was going to mention, which is that you would think that there's a standard, and there may be a standard because the bulk of APIs interact in a common way. But the truth is, there is no defined standard that people must follow. And so I don't know if Stevie mentioned because I stepped away, but the docs are so important because what you expect to happen with an API isn't exactly always what actually happens. And so sometimes you get some things like this that are just a head scratcher.
Yeah.
And you don't know why they did that. But if you want to interact with it, you got to play by their rules.
Yeah. And that's actually a really good segue into Swagger. So Swagger Open API 3.0 is a standard on how you write an API. And it helps you define all the different endpoints and all the different methods for those endpoints. And then you can have schema behind that, which the schema is what helps you to define the parameters and stuff that the endpoint can leverage. If we look at this one, for example, it's got a few, I see, is this going to come up? I'll show you a good one. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see that relatively good. So this is the Swagger endpoint for Sonatype Nexus. It's got all these different API endpoints with all these different methods available and all these different routes inside of the endpoints. So for example, if I wanted to create a new file blob store, for example, I would use the v1 blob stores file endpoint. And if we drill into that, the parameters for it are body, which is an object, and the model is, it's kind of hard to read this stuff. But we have a soft quota, a path, and a name are what it expects. So if we were to try it out, it's expecting a soft quota with a type of space remaining quota and then the limit, which is an integer, and then path and a name. So path could be something on disk, so a ctemp, for example, and then the name is RTP SUG, like that. And then we can execute that. I don't think that's actually going to work. It might. Quota limit. Fine. That's an undocumented server error. That's awesome. This is out. And server error. But you kind of get the point. It needs to have a few things. So if we go back here and do new access store, for example. Oh, actually, that's silly. So for this particular commandlet, if we look at the file, if we're going to create a file type blob store, we need a name, we need the use quota, switch parameter, the quota type, which is a string, and we need the soft quota in megabytes and the path. So I figured all of that information out by reading the schema of this particular endpoint. Let's go to the model again. I infer all of that from this information inside of here. So I found out that soft quota has two types to it. It's got space remaining quota and a space used quota, and the limit is in megabytes, and it's an integer 64. So that's how I figured out that I need those two parameters for the quota bit. And then for the path is the path to the blob store contents to anywhere on the system Nexus has access to, or a path relative to the Sonatype work directory, which basically means give it a folder path and it'll be happy. And then what do I want to call this blob store so that I can identify it inside Nexus Web UI. So inferring all of that out of the schema, came up with the parameters that I would need to create a file-based blob store. But that's why I think Swagger is so awesome and so useful today, especially for a PowerShell developer that has access to an API that is written in Swagger from your development teams or whoever, some third-party vendor. If they've got a Swagger-based API, this is basically your cheat sheet for how to write the PowerShell to interact with that particular API endpoint. For example, you might look at these and say, okay, this one creates a file blob store. Sounds like a new command to me. The new hyphen and something. Put seems to be update a blob store configuration. That seems like a set to me, or an update, or an upgrade, or whatever. Set is typically what I use. Gets are pretty self-explanatory. That should be a get something. Delete should be a remove. So it even helps you name the dumb things as you go through your Swagger doc. And if you understand Invoke-RestMethod, you know that, well, this is going to be a delete method. Here's my content type. All I need to worry about now is what's the URL of the thing going to be? What parameters does it need? And how do I authenticate to the damn thing to make it go? There's just all these little building blocks that are right here inside of this document that will help you on your journey to writing wrappers around APIs. I freaking love APIs. This is the most fun in PowerShell for me, is to find an API and figure out how to PowerShellize it. Especially this one. This Sonatype Nexus one has been so useful because I got tired of monkey patching Sonatype Nexus installations for work. Like, it was a whole bunch of really ugly code to do it the hard way by writing files to the file system and changing directories around and poking services and poking firewalls and all this stuff. They've got an API that does all of that stuff for you via the API. So why not have some PowerShell functions that allow me to connect to this server when it's brand new after it's first installed, connect to it, and then configure the thing. So now all of our setup stuff drains all of the default repositories that ship on the box as part of a fresh installation, gets rid of them all, sets up the repositories we need with the correct repository types, does all the stuff to retrieve API keys and give it to the user and all the stuff. It's all automated as part of our onboarding process, at least on the quick start guide side. If you do it yourself, it's a little bit different in our Azure environment, but still uses the code. It just does it a little bit differently.
We had a not so much a question, but Jason had recommended, did you want to mention the parameters, session variable, or web session, and what the usage would be?
I do, and for that,
And then Josh was kind enough to let you know that you should not be saying I love APIs for everything. You don't want to be saying that about SOAP APIs. I understand.
SOAP can die in a fire. Thankfully, they're pretty much dead in the fire at this point anyways. So, yes, I do want to talk about web sessions. And to do that, I am going to pick on our own product. How do I zoom this in? Can I zoom this in any higher? Apparently not.
If that's right.
Oh, Edge died. That's glorious. Kill. Go. Come on. Come on. All right. This is not going to play nice with me, so I'll just explain it. And do I have... It's not it here either. Actually, it is. It is. Hold on. Here it is. Thank you. So, our central management product, the way to authenticate to that product in a PowerShell way is to send an Invoke-WebRequest to the logon form page itself with a post and this really weird application form URL encoded content type. And the body is going to be the username or email address and the password, which is super awesome. And then we create this session variable called session because the response from this Invoke-WebRequest contains a cookie as part of the object that contains the authentication inside of that cookie and whether it's successful or not. So by having that cookie in the session variable, I can then interact with all the other API endpoints inside of central management by giving it that session, giving Invoke-RestMethod that session variable that will send that cookie along for the ride and authenticate to the API and everything's happy. So you don't necessarily need a header every single time if it in a cookie, basically. So you can use a session for that.
Hey, Stephen.
Yeah.
Is that the only way that I had? That was the only way I found to interact with cookies, or rather to take a cookie I received and use it with subsequent requests. Is there no other way to view cookies from like the result of IRM?
Not easily. I'm going to tell you to just use a session variable because to do it otherwise is black magic ridiculous .NET class stuff that no PowerShell guy should ever have to go through. So just use a session variable. It's the fastest, easiest way to do it. You can use, there is a, what is it? System.net.web. What even is it? There's like a cookie manager thing somewhere. I do not remember exactly where it's at. Haha, cookie container. There it is. System.net.cookie container. You can use one of these bad boys. They're literally Satan. I don't recommend it.
Yeah. Cool, thanks.
Yep. There's other pieces of that puzzle that goes along with it too. Not only do you have containers, you have collections, and then you have to like magic it all into there to make it work, and then you have to do stuff with it after the fact. Whereas you could just say, give me a session variable, and it'll have it in it, and then you can take that and do whatever you want with it. So just do that. And just kind of to bring everything home before we ask if there's any other questions or anything, I wanted to show this off. This is a real world example, sanitized, of course, from a customer that I helped them to create using central management. So they came to us wanting to use our stuff, but they still have SCCM, and SCCM is going to stick around for a very long time for very good reasons. They didn't want to do Google Chrome updates with SCCM anymore. They wanted to use Choco for it, which naturally, that makes a ton of sense. And they wanted to use central management to push out those updates to their endpoints because central management is quite a bit faster than SCCM in a lot of cases. Not every case, but a lot of cases, our stuff is just faster. It's the nature of how it works. They wanted to maintain some level of inventory inside of SCCM that would allow them to build collections of machines based on what software is installed on them, so that they have a collection for outdated Google Chrome, et cetera, such that they could keep the group memberships inside of our central management product up to date, automatically, without any input from them. Because our product also reports that Google Chrome is out of date on those machines, but there's no magic button that you can click to say, hey, only deploy this thing to all of these outdated Google Chrome machines. That's still on the roadmap. Eventually it'll land there. I don't know when. But they have that data in SCCM. They have a collection that has all of those machines in it, and all those machines exist in central management. And we have an API that says, hey, if you know what machines you want to go into a group, we can magically make that happen for you. Not a problem. So what do? We get all of the compute, and there's a couple of different functions inside of here. So the first function here gets literally all the computers out of central management so that we can kind of break it down after the fact. There's a function in here to test if a group exists. So if they are creating a Google Chrome outdated SCCM collection and then creating a group in central management called Google Chrome outdated, they don't want to do that work if it already exists. That'll cause problems. So we have this test function that says, hey, this SCCM collection is trying to be created. Do you already have it? Yes. Fine. It moves on. From there, we add the CCM group based on that test. So if we don't have that group, saying if test group exists, group is false, let's create that group. And that group looks like this. This is the API endpoint for it. It's a post method. With the connect function, we wrote that session variable so we can reuse that session here. It's an application content or application JSON content type. And these are the things that the body of that, the parameters of that API expects. In our case, we're just creating the group, so we don't need to have any groups inside of it or computers inside of it. All we need to know is its name and its description, which can also be null. That's fine to have a group with just a name, no description. So that's why this is in here like this. If you don't pass the description parameter, this is null, and that's totally fine for this particular hash table here. And then we convert it to JSON, we send it up, and we're done. The next thing that we do is we get that group right back. And we select the name and the ID, and we return that group, just so there's less data. All we care about is the ID of the group and the name of the group, and in the console, we let you know that, hey, here's a group. It just got created. After that, we start adding the group members, and this is where we start to get all of the members of the group out of SCCM and only grab their names. And then we grab we grab all the groups and get the ID out of it right here. And then we loop all of those computers coming in from SCCM. And then we check that it is in central management. So basically we say, hey, this machine from SCCM is in central management. Here is the computer ID of that machine. We add it to a collection. Otherwise, we say this machine doesn't report into central management. I'm not going to worry about it. And then this is the required body for updating the group membership. We just build that in, and then we post that to the correct API. And this solved a real world problem for them. They've got this running in some sort of an engine. I don't know if it's just running like using NSSM, the non-sucking service manager, if they like just made a PowerShell service that runs this script, or if they're using Task Scheduler, or if they've got some other system that runs this PowerShell code. All as I know is they've got this code set up to run like every couple hours or something like that. And their SCCM collections update as central management updates the software on the machines, and the group memberships across both are kept in check. And it's been running for quite a while now. Everything's happy. As new versions of Google Chrome come out, the deployment runs like every day at a certain time. So every day, Google Chrome is getting patched across a couple thousand machines, and nobody lifts a finger to make sure it's fine. They don't have to do anything in SCCM anymore. They don't have to do anything in central management or our stuff anymore. It's just done. It's automated. And using a little bit of Invoke-RestMethod and some PowerShell helps solve that rather painful problem for them. There are countless other ways to use APIs. There are countless other products out there that have APIs behind them. I encourage you to seek them out and start solving problems using PowerShell and Invoke-RestMethod. It's fantastic. It's so much fun. So much fun. And with that, do we have any questions? Or any more questions in the room or in chat?
The chat's been pretty vigorous, and a lot of questions have been answered there already. I don't know how much you were able to keep up.
I have seen 0.
There's been a pretty good discussion in the chat.
Good.
So we'll make a last call here. Anybody have any questions or scenarios they want to run by Stevie that maybe need a little more explanation?
Yes, being this.
Yes. Yes. A lot of work-related stuff, but hobby-related stuff, most definitely. One of the biggest ones, hobby-related, I've done was the Cloudsmith API, which is another repository manager. It's just 100% cloud-based. One of the guys that, well, he doesn't work there anymore, but he worked there during the time. He wanted some help with the API. He had some questions. So he asked me, I answered his questions. I got curious. 2 days later, the entire API had been turned into PowerShell, and it's up on GitHub and PowerShell Gallery and all that fun stuff. So catch me on a Friday night and ask me API questions, because by Monday morning, I'll probably just do it for you. It's literally a drug. To me, it really is. Wrapping APIs is so freaking fun. It's like a giant jigsaw puzzle. It really is.
And now you know why I said it's a good person to follow online. Good person to have as a reference when you have a question. Okay,
Stephen. I do have an interesting question, and we can take this offline or wait till after the meeting. It has to do with an application, .NET application, where there isn't an official API, but I've looked at Google Chrome and I can see what's being sent across.
Yeah.
Can Invoke-RestMethod be used to simulate the front end, the web page talking to the back end program?
Absolutely. It absolutely can. And let me see, is this the right one? Is this the right view?
This will be helpful for a nonprofit.
Yeah. So let me see if this actually works this time around. So let's see if I can actually get into this. Been a minute since I logged into this box, so I hope I remember what the credentials are. Holy crap, I think I remembered them.
That's why you send it all to password one.
Yeah. So if you look inside of our web UI, and if you click on the API, here's our Swagger doc. So we've got a lot of different endpoints in here, a lot about software, a lot about weblogs. Like, there's some cool stuff in here. But if you look at the actual web UI and we go to reports, for example, and you say a deployment, and you look at all of these, we have these buttons here for export to PDF and export to Excel. Well, if we were to right click and say, because I don't think, actually, couldn't be able to get to DevTools from here.
It won't pass it in the F12.
I don't think it does. No. So let's open Developer Tools. So let's go to the Network tab. Let's clear all the responses, and let's oops. Let's click this button. So you see this request URL? It's probably freaking not, because it's super small. You see if I can copy this over to this to make it a little bigger. Good Lord. So if we look, weird. There's an API endpoint for it, but it's undocumented. It's not publicly part of our Swagger doc, but there is an API endpoint that allows you, when you click that button, to call it and then give it things. So in this example, I'm saying, give me everything. But if I only wanted successful deployments to be part of that PDF, I could just trim the rest of this off, and that would be that. So that's part of the puzzle. And the other part of the puzzle is in the, I don't think this one in particular has anything interesting in it. Yeah, so this one doesn't really have anything interesting in it, but what this one does is it then calls this API as a file, and then you can download it. So depending on what DevTools tells you, if you can click around on buttons and then inspect the headers of whatever happened, you should be able to get the request URL and any request headers that came along with it, which may or may not include a body.
Right. The headers actually have the request. There's a form that you type in some information and click a button, and it puts that information into the headers that get sent down the line.
Yeah. So yeah, you would absolutely be able to do that.
Oh, great.
Yeah, if you know what the headers are supposed to look like based on clicking the button in the web UI, just create the same headers in PowerShell.
Excellent.
Yeah. Is this a public website?
Yes.
Like, could we try it?
Okay. I'm trying to remember it's to find prisoners within the California prison system.
So before you go down that rabbit hole for a second, I wanted to ask you, so the chocolate thing that you were doing, right? So you said, oh, we have this API documentation, but here's an undocumented API. And so is that a design decision to leave that out, or you just don't document everything because not everything's going to be used that often?
For us, it was a design decision. Don't really need people to have a programmatic way to.
Yeah, I think typically it's a this is what we want to make publicly accessible, but also that maybe, or maybe we'll get it, but we don't need it right now.
Yeah.
And so it's just easier to put it all together into APIs, and then we can work with it.
Yeah.
But then long term, it's this thing that, hey, whatever we want to do. And so when you're just, hey, inspecting some of that, and then, hey, you're just gotta kind of test with it. Well, it looks like he put in hey, I can get success value, I can get all these values. Maybe it won't work. If you only put success, maybe it goes, oh, nope, you need these 3 options. It may throw errors at you. So you just need to, especially if it's undocumented. So some of those things you may not.
It's a lot of trial and error.
Yeah,
But
you'll fuzz it.
But on the design side, it sounds like maybe you guys said something like, this is not a typical function that someone would do programmatically. There's a UI element to do this interactively, so we don't need to document it in the code.
Exactly.
It's there for us because we might need to use it, but for the general purpose, for the general user population, we want you to go through the interactive GUI, not
Right. I asked the people who administer if there is an API, and they said no. I'm thinking.
Now let's dive into what Mark is doing with the prison system in California. That sounds more
Usually answering questions on some site, but I think that the point being is like, I played with this with Jermaine for a while ago in interfacing with some of the Citrix stuff, and they give you like a GUI to do it, but there's no, you look in their API documentation and it's this generic like, hey, give me a report. But then how to generate all that stuff, it's all built into I had to use the GUI to give me what all that happened, use developer tools, and then at that point, hey, I can get this one. Well, then we basically parse the rest of it to go, well, I can use this other API to go get me the users. I can use this to give me time. I can this to give me the time, and then generate reports as we need them. And so dynamically keep asking for, they'll only give you a report for every 90 days. Well, then do some magic. I'll just count. I'll just give me 15 reports over the next 90 days for the past 3 years. And then just magically, magically, but let PowerShell do the work for you and just let it loop through every 90 days over the past, 3 years. And there's your, 15 sets of reports.
Yeah.
Right.
DevTools is super powerful and super awesome. All it takes is a little bit of time and being sadistic enough to spend the time to reverse engineer the thing to turn it into PowerShell.
So just want to give a quick little shout out here to Ryan Richter, who wrote something very prophetic in the chat, which basically says some things don't get documented because you can do it, but it doesn't necessarily have any guardrails. And so they don't really want to make it easy for people to do because you can get yourself into a lot of trouble. And so that makes sense to me.
Well, to that point is that we don't officially support using it outside of what we've given to you in this regard.
Yeah.
And so to that point is like back in the where we work with Citrix, it's like, yeah, they're happy to give you the report whenever you ask for it, but we'll give it to you in 90-day increments. But then I got to come back to this API again, or this UI again, and go through that and do this GUI kind of thing. Like, I don't want to do that. I want to get 15 set of reports over the past 3 months. Like I'm going to do it at scale for 3,000 users. Yeah, it's a little harder to do in the GUI.
If you're watching this at home, don't forget to check out our YouTube channel. We have plenty of other videos. And if you want to come and join us in person, you can hit us up at rtpsub.com or find us on Meetup. And you get to ask the questions of our presenters. I want to say thank you to Stevie Coaster. 2,400 miles in the snow to get here. Thank you very much, Stevie.
Uphill both ways.
And so we're going to say goodnight to everybody at home. Here, we're going to hang out and chat a little bit longer. We hope you had a great time. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.